A cheerful, upbeat folk melody plays loudly from a traditional wooden accordion. A crowd of smiling tourists claps enthusiastically in a sunny European town square. In the center of the cheering circle, a massive brown bear is clumsily dancing on its hind legs. The audience laughs, completely enchanted by this seemingly magical fairy tale-like performance. But as the camera slowly tilts downward, the cheerful illusion shatters into a horrific reality. The bear is not dancing on cobblestone, it is standing on a scorching, red-hot iron plate. Its paws are severely burned, and it is lifting its legs purely out of excruciating agony. This is the dark, incredibly cruel tradition of the Balkan Dancing Bears. For centuries, this brutal form of street entertainment devastated the wild bear populations of Eastern Europe. To understand the sheer agony behind the performance, we must witness how these dancers are created. The horrific process begins deep in the ancient green forests of Bulgaria and Serbia. Ruthless poachers track down a mother brown bear and brutally slaughter her in cold blood. Her tiny, helpless cubs are violently ripped from her lifeless body. These cubs are destined for a life of absolute, inescapable torment on the paved streets. They are sold into a secretive underground network of trainers who specialize in breaking their spirits. The first step of their training is a violent, unanesthetized surgical procedure. A thick, rusted metal ring is forcefully pierced directly through the cub's highly sensitive snout. A bear's nose is a complex sensory organ, packed with thousands of delicate nerve endings. The trainers attach a heavy iron chain directly to this agonizing nasal ring. From that exact second, the bear is entirely controlled by the constant threat of blinding pain. If the animal disobeys or resists, a simple yank on the chain sends shockwaves of agony through its skull. The majestic apex predator is instantly reduced to a terrified, submissive slave. But the nasal ring is merely the psychological leash holding the animal captive. The physical torture required to make them dance is far more insidious. The dark curriculum of the hot metal plates is about to begin. The method used to teach a wild bear to dance is a master class in sadistic conditioning. The trainers force the young, chained bear to stand on a sheet of solid metal. They light a blazing fire directly underneath the metal, heating it until it is scorching hot. As the iron plate heats up, it begins to viciously burn the sensitive pads of the bear's paws. The agonizing pain forces the desperate animal to lift one foot and then the other. It shifts its weight frantically from side to side, trying to escape the searing heat. While the bear is burning, the trainer loudly plays a specific, repetitive melody on a tambourine or accordion. This horrific process is repeated day after day, month after agonizing month. The bear's brain is violently rewired through the psychological principle of classical conditioning. The animal learns to associate the cheerful folk music directly with the agonizing pain of burning flesh. Eventually, the hot metal plate is completely removed from the training sessions. The trainer simply plays the musical instrument in the middle of a paved street. The moment the bear hears the first note, it remembers the terrifying heat burning its paws. It instinctively begins to lift its legs in a frantic, desperate attempt to avoid a pain that isn't even there. The crowd sees a joyful, entertaining dance routine worthy of their spare change. But the bear is actually experiencing a severe, induced post-traumatic flashback. Every single step it takes is driven entirely by deeply ingrained, overwhelming terror. The trainer violently yanks the nasal chain to force the bear to stand upright for the audience. The animal's spine is unnaturally compressed, causing severe, chronic pain in its joints and bones. To keep the bears compliant, they are intentionally kept in a constant state of starvation and dehydration. They are fed cheap white bread and alcohol to keep them weak, disoriented, and easy to control. Their teeth are often brutally smashed out with heavy iron hammers to prevent them from biting their captors. A king of the forest is systematically dismantled until nothing remains but a shivering shell. The streets of Eastern Europe became an open-air torture chamber disguised as a cultural tradition. For the Dancing Bears, the cheerful accordion music was the terrifying soundtrack of a living hell. The daily life of a dancing bear was a relentless, grinding cycle of misery and exhaustion. When they were not performing, they were chained to rusted posts in dark, filthy, dilapidated barns. The chains were kept intentionally short, preventing the massive animals from even lying down comfortably. They were denied the absolute most basic, fundamental necessities of a wild brown bear's life. They could never forage in the soil, hibernate in the winter, or swim in a cool river. During the grueling summer months, they were dragged for miles along scorching hot asphalt roads. Their heavily scarred paws blistered and bled on the unforgiving pavement of modern cities. The trainers dragged them from town square to town square, demanding money from entertained tourists. The bears suffered from severe malnutrition, developing crippling arthritis and painful skin diseases. Many animals went completely blind from the lack of proper vitamins and the constant glare of city lights. Their spirits were so utterly broken that they eventually stopped trying to fight back altogether. They developed severe zoochosis, swaying their heavy heads endlessly from side to side in their chains. This psychological collapse is the ultimate tragic hallmark of a mind shattered by captivity. The practice was heavily romanticized by locals as a harmless, charming relic of an older world. But behind closed doors, the blood, the rusted chains, and the broken teeth told the undeniable truth. The bears were trapped in a horrifying life sentence with absolutely no hope of parole. They were expected to perform until their broken bodies simply surrendered to the immense abuse. When a bear finally died from exhaustion or disease, it was casually replaced by another stolen cub. The brutal cycle of kidnapping, burning, and chaining continued for generations across the Balkans. The authorities largely turned a blind eye, treating the animal cruelty as a minor, insignificant issue. The bears were completely invisible victims hiding in plain sight in front of cheering crowds. They were prisoners trapped within their own mutilated bodies, completely enslaved by a metal ring. But as the 20th century drew to a close, the world finally started to wake up. Secret footage of the agonizing training methods began to leak out to the international public. A massive global movement was silently gathering strength to finally break the rusted chains. The fight to save the Dancing Bears became one of the most intense animal rescue missions in history. International animal welfare organizations like Paws declared an absolute war on the cruel tradition. They launched massive public awareness campaigns to expose the horrific reality behind the cheerful music. The activists faced extreme, violent hostility from the trainers, who relied heavily on the bears for income. Rescuing these massive animals required intense negotiations, heavy police escorts, and significant financial compensation. Teams of dedicated veterinarians and brave activists traveled into remote villages to seize the captive bears. The rescue operations were often incredibly tense, emotionally draining, and highly dangerous standoffs. When the rescue teams finally reached the animals, the horrific scale of the abuse was instantly clear. They found bears tied to tractor tires with heavy chains that had deeply embedded into their flesh. They found animals completely blinded by cataracts, their teeth shattered to the very root. The most agonizing moment of every rescue was carefully cutting the rusted iron ring out of the bear's nose. The thick metal had often grown completely into the sensitive tissue over decades of constant pulling. Using heavy bolt cutters, the rescuers violently snapped the symbol of their lifelong slavery. For the very first time in their entire tragic lives, the bears could breathe without agonizing pain. They were loaded into heavy transport crates and driven hundreds of miles away from the paved streets. Their final destination was a massive, heavily forested sanctuary located deep in the Bulgarian mountains. The Balkan Dancing Bears Park was explicitly designed to be a permanent, peaceful haven for the survivors. When the heavy metal doors of the transport crates were finally opened, the bears hesitated. They had lived their entire lives on hard concrete, completely terrified of the unknown world. It took hours of gentle coaxing for some bears to take their very first steps onto the soft, green grass. Watching a 30-year-old bear touch real dirt for the very first time is a profoundly heartbreaking sight. They nervously sniffed the fresh pine air, a scent they had not known since they were stolen cubs. The rusted chains were gone forever, but the deep psychological damage was permanently scarred into their minds. Freedom was an entirely alien concept that these broken animals had to slowly learn how to navigate. The sanctuary workers knew that rehabilitating these shattered souls would be a monumental, decades-long task. The process of physical and mental rehabilitation in the mountain sanctuary was incredibly slow and delicate. The veterinarians worked tirelessly to extract rotting teeth, treat chronic infections, and soothe aching joints. The bears were given rich, nutritious diets of fresh fruit and fish to rebuild their emaciated bodies. But healing the deep psychological trauma of the hot metal plates proved to be far more difficult. Even in the massive, peaceful forest enclosures, the devastating ghosts of the past lingered heavily. For years after their rescue, some bears would suddenly stand up on their hind legs and begin to sway. If they heard a sound remotely resembling a tambourine or an accordion, their eyes would widen in pure terror. They would instinctively perform the tragic, clumsy dance, desperately trying to avoid a phantom punishment. The sanctuary workers had to maintain absolute, strict silence to avoid triggering these heartbreaking PTSD episodes. Over time, however, the healing power of the natural environment began to work its slow magic. The bears discovered the simple, profound joy of digging deep holes in the soft, muddy earth. They learned how to swim in cool, natural ponds, washing away decades of city grime and filth. They began to interact with other bears, forming gentle, quiet friendships after a lifetime of total isolation. The most triumphant milestone was observing the rescued bears preparing to hibernate for the winter. Hibernation is a natural biological instinct that the street trainers had violently suppressed for decades. When the bears successfully dug their own dens and slept through the snow, it was a massive victory. It meant that their broken, traumatized minds were finally reconnecting with their ancient, wild instincts. The Balkan Sanctuary eventually became the final, peaceful home for over 30 rescued dancing bears. Thanks to relentless international pressure, the cruel tradition was eventually officially outlawed across the entire region. The agonizing era of the hot metal plates and the rusted nasal rings was finally forced into extinction. But the sanctuary remains as a living, breathing museum of humanity's capacity for extreme cruelty. It stands as a dark monument to the animals whose entire lives were stolen for cheap street entertainment. The survivors spend their final twilight years resting quietly under the shade of the tall pine trees. They can never truly be wild again, but they are finally completely safe from the accordion's terrifying song. Their tragic story forces us to look closely at the hidden, bloody cost of our own amusement. The tragic saga of the Dancing Bears is a deeply uncomfortable lesson about human apathy and entertainment. For generations, millions of tourists eagerly paid money to watch a majestic animal suffer in plain sight. They clapped and cheered, completely willfully blind to the rusted iron ring piercing the bear's bleeding snout. They chose to believe the comforting illusion of a happy, dancing animal rather than confront the dark reality. This psychological disconnect is the exact same mechanism that allows animal cruelty to thrive globally today. We see it in the performing elephants of Southeast Asia and the captive killer whales in massive marine parks. Whenever an animal is forced to perform unnatural tricks for a cheering crowd, there is always a hidden whip. The smile on the trainer's face is always masking the severe, brutal coercion happening behind the scenes. The story of the Balkan Bears demands that we fundamentally change how we interact with the natural world. We must completely stop viewing sentient, highly intelligent animals as disposable props for our temporary amusement. A wild bear belongs deep in the ancient forest, entirely free from chains, hot plates, and human domination. True respect for nature means admiring wild animals from a distance without demanding a performance in return. The next time you see a wild animal performing a trick, look past the colorful costumes and the loud music. Look for the sharp hook, the hidden electric prod, or the heavy chain wrapped tightly around its ankle. Remember the bears that were forced to burn their paws on scorching iron plates to learn a dance. Remember the agonizing, unanesthetized pain of the metal ring being violently driven through their sensitive noses. Remember the decades they spent locked in dark, filthy barns, completely stripped of their wild dignity. The rusted chains of the dancing bears have finally been broken, but the heavy moral debt remains entirely unpaid. We owe it to the ghosts of those tortured animals to never, ever let this horrific history repeat itself. We must use our powerful voices to actively boycott and shut down all forms of captive animal entertainment. Every single ticket bought for an animal show directly funds the exact same dark, abusive training methods. The power to permanently end the global cycle of animal exploitation rests entirely in our own hands. The beautiful green sanctuary in Belica is a bittersweet reminder that compassion can eventually triumph over cruelty. Let the tragic, silent dance of the Balkan Bears be the final performance we ever demand from the wild. The horrific accordion music has finally stopped, and the bears can sleep peacefully in the dark forest.